Andalusia has undergone many changes since its glorious Islamic era. Yet, even in present-day Christian Spain, it seems there still exists here that duality of sacred and profane, of spirituality and sensuality, recalling in a sense the Arabian Nights of a millennium ago. This duality of piety and worldliness was also one of the hallmarks of the Jewish Golden Age. In one of his poems, Rabbi Samuel HaNagid recommended devoting oneself both to worship of the Lord and to the pleasures of life. Make ye time for the Lord, he wrote, and times for thyselves. Give ye him half the day, and half for thine own deeds, and give ye no respite to wine in thy nights. Morning in the royal gardens of Cordova. 3 gentlewomen stroll by the poolside among the flower beds. As they approach, we try to engage them in conversation, but no. One of them, the third, won't agree unless we wait, so that she too can appear like her companions in festive Andalusian costume. And here she is back again. What an appearance. Now the camera could roll.
¿Por qué están vestidas así? ¿Tiene algo de la feria o
sí,
algo?
La feria
¿De la feria de Córdoba?
Sí.
Pues,
Dígame, ¿qué tiene Córdoba de especial? A ver.
Tiene un encanto muy bonito.
Es muy
Tiene un
señorial.
embrujo.
Es
Un embrujo.
Un brujo.
Pero los de Granada dicen que ahí tiene el embrujo.
Bueno, cada
las mujeres-
Andalucía, cada rincón
Sí.
de Andalucía
Tienes-
tiene un embrujo distinto.
Especial cada sitio es
Distinto.
especial. Cada sitio es
Sevilla
especial,
tiene un
de por sí.
embrujo,
Sí.
Granada tiene un embrujo,
Sí.
Córdoba tiene un embrujo moruno,
Su encanto.
su canto,
En Granada
Esto
aquella
es más,
canción.
Córdoba es más apacible, más serena, más,
Sí,
más
serena.
tranquila.
muy señorial y muy tranquila.
Esta
Ahí en Granada, como dice la canción, tu tierra está llena de lindas mujeres, de
Mujeres.
sangre y de sol.
sí, pero,
Aquí
pero
hay lindas,
Córdoba,
veo que hay lindas mujeres y veo que hay sol.
sol, mucho.
¿Sangre también?
Sangre,
La
sangre mora.
Sangre caliente, sangre
Ah,
caliente.
mora,
¿Sangre mora?
sangre mora.
¿Usted cree que es mora?
Bueno, yo no sé,
Un
pero...
poco rubia, ¿no?
Yo, pero aquí he teñido, es de bote.
Ah.
De bote.
¿O puede ser sangre judía?
Pues de todo, de todo.
¿Sabe? Como aquí muchos judíos.
Los judíos, claro.
¿Puede ser o no?
Sí, ¿por qué? Yo no
No
lo
hay
discuto
duda.
eso.
No one knows exactly when the Jews arrived in Spain. Historians estimate that it was after the fall of Jerusalem, during the Great Dispersion 2,000 years ago. Spain was then a thriving Roman province with temples and theaters, but virtually nothing is known about its Jewish population at that time. The earliest Jewish names appear in this trilingual inscription, in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. This is the tombstone of Meliosa, a young woman aged 24 who lived in Spain at the same time as the Mishnaic period in the land of Israel. Meliosa and her parents, Judah and Miriam, are, one could say, the first Sephardic Jews we know by name. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Iberian Peninsula was invaded by barbaric Teutonic tribes. One of these, the Visigoths, founded a Christian kingdom with Toledo as its capital. Even during the rule of the Visigoths, when in the East, in Babylon, Talmudic sages were in the limelight, the Jews of Spain lived in obscurity. We would never have known they existed were it not for the anti-Jewish edicts and forced conversions enacted here in Toledo. The dramatic turning point in the history of Spanish Jewry began here. This massive rock, which poets liken to a crouching lion, was believed in ancient times to be one of the two pillars of Hercules, which guard the gates of earth. The second lies across the straits in Africa. In the year 711, these waters, which divide Europe and Africa, witnessed an event which would change the face of Spain and bring the Jews out of their darkness into a great light. The Moors, Arab and Berber warriors from North Africa, would steal across the straits in rowboats. Landing here at this very spot, they would seek a hasty hideout in the caves on this rock, later to be known as Jebel Tariq, Gibraltar, after the Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad. Tariq set out with his small army to the north. The Christian Visigoths tried to fend him off, but to no avail. There was no stopping the Arab onslaught. City after city fell to the Moors, and the chronicles of the time relate that the invaders were welcomed as redeemers by the Jewish population. In many places, the conquered cities were handed over to Jewish garrisons. Only 90 years after the birth of Islam, the Arabs had succeeded in dominating vast territories, ranging from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. The invasion of Spain was the final step in Islam's amazing expansion. Spain was a new, captivating country. The Arabs found here an abundance of fertile land and rich harvests. Grazing land was also plentiful. But what most impressed these desert-wise invaders was the sight of water, the broad, abundant rivers. They expressed their amazement by giving them such names as Wadi el-Kabir, the mighty stream, still preserved in Spanish as Guadalquivir. Within a few years, there arose a new Arabic kingdom, El-Andalus, and its capital, Cordova, on the banks of the Guadalquivir, was to become the pearl of the West.
קורדובה במאה העשירית.
At that time, Cordova may well have been the most prosperous city in the entire world. Like 9th century Baghdad in the days of Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'amun, 10th century Cordova under the reign of Abdurrahman III and his son al-Hakam was a beacon of Islamic civilization. In those days, it was the most advanced of all. The city attracted scientists and scholars from all over the world. The library that once stood here is said to have contained some 600,000 manuscripts. In this library, the caliphs of Cordova amassed both sacred and secular writings. There were impressive collections of the Quran and other Islamic scriptures, as well as all the treasures of Greek science, Persian poetry, and Indian wisdom, to say nothing of the Arabic poets, philosophers, physicians, and scientists. Arab culture flourished while England, France, Italy, Germany, and other European countries were still deep in the Dark Ages. Of this vast legendary library of Cordova, no trace remains. One reminder of those days is the monument erected by Cordova in memory of its native son, Ali ibn Ahmad ibn Hazm, a great theologian and author of the Book of Religious Sects, which also included polemics regarding Christianity and Judaism. The opposite, rationalistic side of Islamic wisdom is represented by Abdul Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, the famous Averroes, who more than any other Arab philosopher had a profound influence on European thinking during the dawn of the Renaissance. Sic transit gloria mundi, as the ancient saying goes. So passes the glory of this world. This city of Cordova was once a beacon of wisdom and the arts, as were Athens, Alexandria, and Constantinople in their day, as Florence would be during the Renaissance. Cordova today is a city of workers. They earn their living by manual labor as artisans and from tourism. The main tourist attraction is the Great Mosque. The pride of Cordova, this mosque gives us some idea of the glory of Muslim Spain. Even today, more than 1,000 years after it was built, it is an amazing sight. A forest of over 800 marble pillars capped by checkered arches in red and white. On Fridays, this vast space would be packed with thousands of faithful in their white robes, prostrating themselves and proclaiming in unison, Allahu Akbar, God is great. The mihrab, the ornate niche facing Mecca, is where the Caliph would pray. They say that this is where they kept the famous Quran of Caliph Othman, written in his own hand and studded with precious pearls and rubies. A few miles from Cordova, we find the ruins of Medinat Az-Zahra. This was the Versailles of the Caliph Abdul Rahman III, which he built for himself as a refuge from the clamor and stench of city life. It was here that he brought his wives and concubines. Some say he had 600, including the one he loved the most, Zahra, after whom the palace was named. Here the Caliph conducted affairs of state, received royal guests and foreign emissaries. Amongst Abdul Rahman's closest counselors was a certain Jewish physician, Chistai ibn Shaprut. Chistai was destined to become a legend in Jewish history. He was the first in a long line of physicians, financial advisors, and diplomats who served the Spanish rulers faithfully for more than half a millennium. Chistai, or Hasdai ben Shaprut, brought about the Jewish cultural revolution here in Spain. Perhaps more than anyone else, he deserves to be called the father of the Golden Age. He symbolizes the dawn of a new era in which the center of the Jewish world shifted from Babylon to Spain. He drew the Jews here, sent out emissaries to acquire manuscripts on almost every subject: theology, the sciences, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, whatever. The Jewish Renaissance, the Golden Age, came about, amongst other reasons, due to the desire of the Jews of Spain to escape the confines of their own spiritual world and to open themselves up to the dominant Arabic culture, which at that time prevailed throughout the world. The Israel Museum recently exhibited a selection of books from Spain, from among the treasures of the National Library in Jerusalem. Here we can sample some of the fruits of that openness, which gave birth to the most remarkable Jewish literature after the Bible and the Talmud.
הוא כתב את הספרים האלה על ההלכות ממצרים, אבל הוא תמיד התייחס לנוכחות של העם היהודי בישראל כאל דבר מובן מאליו. ויש כאן חוקים שמתייחסים אל הנוכחות של העם היהודי בישראל, אל כל מיני דברים שקשורים ליום-יום, ממש הלכות לגבי היום-יום, איך לנהוג בכל התחומים.
Anyone seeking a solution to the historical enigma of how a dispersed and scattered nation could survive as one people, without territory, without king or army, will find the answer in these books.
עכשיו, אנחנו יודעים שהרמב"ם היה רופא, ואנחנו עד היום לומדים מהספרים שלו על כל מיני תרופות וצמחי מרפא, אבל היהודים הספרדים עסקו גם במדע, כמו אסטרונומיה, מתמטיקה ורפואה כמובן. יש לנו כאן ספר רפואה שמתאר בפרטי פרטים איך לנתח ניתוח בטן מאוד מסובך.
Unlike the Jews of Ashkenaz who dwelt in a closed world of religious laws and learning, the Jews of Sepharad opened up new avenues to the outside world. Jewish philosophy, culminating in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, is replete with concepts derived from Greek philosophy. This book is a heroic endeavor to reconcile Athens with Jerusalem and to prove that the wisdom of Israel is no less valid than that of Greece. Such a duality of sacred and secular, the result of exposure to Arab culture, finds its most powerful expression amongst the poets. As a young boy attending synagogue, for me Samuel Hanagid, Shlomo ibn Gabirol, Moshe ibn Ezra, and Yehuda Halevi were first and foremost the authors of hymns and prayers. I was young then, and one bright day I discovered to my amazement that all these wondrous liturgical poets, these rabbis, didn't only write songs of praise to the Almighty. They also wrote verses for the pleasure of man. That same Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote dozens of love songs. One of them, addressed to a certain lady, reads thus: If separation be decreed upon us, stay thee a while until I behold thy countenance. In the name of love, remember the days of thy desire, even as I shall remember the nights of thy passion. When thine image passeth in my dreams, I shall pass through thy dreams as well. Honeycomb and honey are between thy lips, as frankincense and myrrh between thy breasts. May my right hand forget its cunning, even as my left, if I forget the love of thine espousals. The city of Cordova named a public square after Yehuda Halevi, the greatest Jewish poet of the Golden Age. The local tavern is also named after the poet, whom Heine said derived his rhymes from the strings of David's harp. Yehuda Halevi lived here for many a long year. It was here he wrote, loved, and drank his wine.
Y al río yo le conté este quieres que me ahoga.
800 years later, Cordova is still a city of song and dance. Flamenco, born in this southern Spanish province, is a gypsy version of ancient Arab Andalusian dances. Some musicologists also detect in it strains of the Jewish-Spanish romanza.
Dame la mano tu palomba para subir al tu nido. Maldicha que duermes sola, vengo a dormir contigo.
One evening, with a local gypsy troupe, we tried an experiment.
Esta es loca, quiere que la quiera yo.
I was curious to know whether the words and music I had heard in my childhood in Jerusalem from my mother and her neighbors would find a response here in Cordova, the cradle of the Golden Age.
¿Esta conoce? Ah, ¿Esta la conoce?
Esa la conocemos, sí.
A ver cómo la canta. La serena. ¿Digo la serrana o la serena? Serrana.
Serrana.
Serrana. Bueno, a ver, cante la serrana.
Y esta serrana está loca y quiere que la quiera yo y que la quiera a su marido, compañera de mi alma, que tiene la obligación.
יש שיר אחד,
There's one song the gypsies don't like to sing. It tells of a beautiful Jewish girl.
מתלהבים לשיר אותו, מספר על בחורה יהודייה.
Where are you
יפה.
off to at this unseemly hour? Off to the synagogue to meet Rebecca. This was apparently the masculine form of the name Rebecca.
את רבקו. זה כנראה הזכר של רבקה.
The story goes that she was extremely attractive to men, but as soon as they became attached to her, she would scorn them. One would kill himself, another would go mad. Then one day she herself fell in love, but he did not respond, thus wreaking the revenge of all the men she had abandoned. Let's see if the gypsies here will agree to sing it. They once told me it brings bad luck. We'll soon find out.
Señores, ¿pueden cantarme la petenera?
No, porque se apaga la luz.
¿Por qué no?
Porque tiene más ramos. Ahora, ¿cómo traducimos eso al antiguo?
¿Por qué no?
Tiene mal bajío.
Mala suerte.
Mala suerte.
Mala suerte.
In the year 1013, North African Berbers destroyed Cordova. Medinat az-Zahra lay in ruins. This was the end of the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. However, the Berbers didn't dare touch the great Umayyad Mosque. It stands to this day as a monument to an enlightened and tolerant rule, which endowed Muslim civilization with some of its most glorious years, and the Jews with a great cultural renaissance, their golden age. Visiting the site where the caliphs once prayed, I recall that throughout the entire 2.5 centuries of Umayyad rule, the Jews hardly ever underwent persecution, an extraordinary phenomenon in Jewish history, with its long line of cruel decrees and pogroms. After the collapse of the Caliphate of Cordova, Muslim Spain split into more than 30 independent principalities, which incessantly waged war one on another. At this stage in the history of Spain, the city of Granada assumes a key role.
זוהי גרנדה.
Granada. Rabbi Samuel Hanagid called it the pomegranate of Spain. The Arabs called it Granatat al-Yahud, because for a time most of its residents were Jews. The snow-clad Sierra Nevada were called by Hebrew poets the mountains of Senir, a biblical synonym for Mount Hermon. Granada was a Jewish metropolis which gave us Moshe ibn Ezra, Yehuda ibn Tibon, and more. But the most outstanding figure here was Rabbi Samuel Hanagid, who arrived as a hapless refugee from Cordova and rose to a status unprecedented in all the history of the Jews of Spain. He was not only a great poet, he was also a grammarian and linguistic scholar. But his greatest claim to fame is that at one and the same time he served as prime minister, finance minister, foreign minister, defense minister, and chief of staff. But he wasn't an armchair general. He took an active part in campaigns for almost 20 years and kept a kind of war diary. His poems in Hebrew document dramatically his battle experiences. Randa was one of the Arab principalities alternately at war and at peace with Samuel Hanagid's Granada. Once, in a savage battle, the ruler of Randa, Abu Nur, barely managed to escape back to his fortress city. Samuel Hanagid wrote 2 songs of victory describing the event and ordered his son to dispatch copies to the Jews of Jerusalem. Over the last 1,000 years, the picturesque city of Randa and the deep canyon which cuts through it have known a great deal of affliction and horror. Some half a century ago, during the Spanish Civil War, hundreds of prisoners were hurled off this bridge into the gorge, an incident which made a profound impression on Ernest Hemingway when he later wrote his book, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Hemos leído que aquí de este puente de arriba abajo durante la guerra civil echaron aquí los republicanos casi 500 personas.
No, no, no.
¿No es así?
No es así. Fueron miles de personas.
¿Miles, no cientos?
Los miles.
No me diga.
No se ve.
Samuel Hanagid described his battle experiences in a language that had not been heard since the Song of Deborah and the Psalms. He made use of daring metaphor, which would not shame any modern-day poet. And the earth shook to its very foundations, overturned as in the cataclysm of Gomorrah. For today is a day of gloom and darkness. The sun, like my heart, is black, and the horses shall canter to and fro, like vipers abandoned in their lair. As if when the lances were cast, thunderbolts filled the air with their light, and the arrows like a rainstorm, and the backs of the dead were honeycombed like a sieve, their bows in their hands like snakes, and each snake shall vomit forth a bee. Samuel Hanagid wasn't only a war poet. He also wrote of love and wine. He was the first Hebrew flower poet since the Song of Songs. In these Andalusian gardens, amid the roses and fragrant spice bushes, the character of a new kind of Jew was formed. A Jew who believed that fear of God doesn't contradict a love of beauty and the pleasures of life. There were poets strolling through these gardens who were very Jewish and very human. Their poetry was not rural, but urbane. They didn't speak of love, but of desire, not of pastures, but of gardens such as this, with its flowers, trees, myrtle shrubs, and fountains. Moshe ibn Ezra, who was born here, wrote a poem describing a similar scene. The garden wore a coat of many colors, its lawn and embroidered raiment. Each tree was clad in a checkered cloak, and every eye beheld its wonder.
קוטנות פסים לבש הגן, וכסות רקמה מדי דשאו, ומעיל תשבץ עתה כל עץ, ולכל עין הראה פלאו. קוטנות פסים לבש הגן, וכסות רקמה מדי.
Almost nothing remains of the Granada of Samuel Hanagid and of Moshe ibn Ezra. This garden of Alhambra was planted by the Arab rulers some 200 years after the golden age of the Jews came to its end. Amazing as it may seem, Many of the features, the sights, and sounds of Alhambra were described in detail by both Jewish and Arab poets here in Andalusia long before it was actually built. The Alhambra, jewel in the crown of late Muslim architecture in Spain. From the outside, it looks like a fortress, but once you enter, as though like a wave of a magic wand, you find yourself in another world. The legendary world of the Arabian Nights. Muslim artisans, prohibited by their religion from portraying human forms, lavish their talents on arabesques, an interplay of line and color, latticework, curlicues, and ornate inscriptions from the Quran. Wala ghalid illallah, there is no victor but Allah. Again, although this palace was built many years after the destruction of Granada's Jewish community, it would seem that the poets of the Golden Age had already written of something similar. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, for example, wrote an exact description of the Myrtle Court, a pool of water surrounded by myrtle bushes. In another wing of the palace, the Lion's Court, we encounter another literary puzzle. Shlomo ibn Gabirol, who visited Granada in 1045 as the guest of Samuel Hanagid, wrote a poem entitled The Palace and the Garden, in which he described a palace very similar to the Alhambra, which in his day didn't exist. Most amazing of all is his description of a fountain, an exact picture of the Alhambra fountain. A basin of water held aloft by 12 lions, the precise number. He likened the streams of water pouring forth from their mouths to mighty roaring. As young lions roaring for their prey, springs burst forth from within them, flow from their mouths like mighty streams.
That
was how this great Hebrew poet described it. But the riddle remains. How could he have possibly envisaged such a fountain, which would only be built 200 years later? Maybe he saw something similar somewhere else. It remains a riddle with no solution. Those who see Jewish life in Muslim Spain as a happy era in which Jew and Arab coexisted in tolerance and friendship are right, but only about the early Umayyad era. After the collapse of the caliphates in the early 11th century, there were only brief periods of tranquility. Strangely enough, in that later period in which Jewish creativity reached its summit, the Jews were subjected to persecution and expulsion. Rabbi Shlomo ibn Gabirol, poet and philosopher, was born in Malaga to a family which had fled from persecution in Cordova. He lived for several years in Saragossa, migrated to Granada, then headed for Valencia, where he spent the rest of his days. Even Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon, founder of a famous dynasty of translators, honored today by a monument in his birthplace, Granada, was driven out by Muslim fanatics and fled to Provence. Many Jews were forced to wander in those days. It's not easy to find even one single prominent Jewish personality in Spain who was born, lived, and died in the same place. The greatest of them all, Maimonides, was also a refugee. In Cordova, we can find a statue in honor of Maimonides, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. Outstanding physician, foremost authority in Jewish law, and the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages. He was only 13 years old when his family fled from Cordova and from the edicts of forced conversion imposed by Muslim zealots. Their wanderings began in Morocco and ended in Egypt, where he wrote his major works, Mishneh Torah, and a guide to the perplexed.
マイモニデスっていう名前の人なんですけれど、そしてもう小さい13歳ぐらいにはですね、もうここを離れて、アフリカの方に入っていくんですけれど、カイロでですね、20歳ぐらいに入って、そして有名なお医者さんであって、そして哲学者でもあって、数学者であって、いろんなことをですねした人ということで、コルドバから出ていった人で、やっぱりそのカイロでですね、王様向こうのですね王様に仕えてた人ということで、大変有名だった人ということで、ここに作られてます。そしてこの人はカイロで死んだということになってるんですけど、そこにプレートがあるんですけれど、実際一応話では、伝説っていうんですか、ではですね、イスラエルの、タイベリダスっていうところでね、死んだということになってますということです。
And
Very good
finished.
translation.
It's a very fine. Moshe lo kanke Moshe. This is very fine. It's lovely in Hebrew. Mi Moshe.
Hebrew.
Hebrew. Yes, the language of Jewish people. Yeah. Mi Moshe lo kanke Moshe. I mean, between Moses and Moses, there's nothing in between. I mean, he was as great as Moses. The Bible was. He was a great man. My mind is Arambam. Arambam. Bye bye. Shalom.
And it all began here on Calle del Judíos. This is how it looks today. The main street of the Jewish quarter in Cordova, where Chizdai ibn Shaprut inaugurated the Golden Age, where Dunash ben Labrat, Yehuda Halevi, and Abraham ibn Ezra lived and worked, where Yonah ibn Janach, Samuel Hanagid, and Maimonides were born. Where in the world can you find a street like this?
Buenos días, buen día. Disculpe la molestia.
No, la molestia, que me da vergüenza.
Bueno, usted cree que yo no tengo, también soy tímido un poco, pero nos acostumbramos.
A ver, un remedio.
Sí, hace rato que vive aquí usted.
Pues hace 15 años.
15 años. Dígame, aquí, barrio judío, ¿qué queda de aquella
De aquí
época? Algo,
nada, la calle solamente.
El nombre de la calle.
El nombre de la calle, y judío en realidad no vive ninguno.
No vive. ¿Hay alguna tradición, algún cuento acerca de los judíos en aquella época aquí? ¿Alguien habla de eso? ¿Qué dicen?
Sí. Bueno, se dice eso lo de siempre, que cuando los reyes católicos los expulsaron, por lo que quisieron quedarse viviendo, pues se metieron en este barrio.
Well, as I was telling you, this is a synagogue, which is important because it is the only classical synagogue remaining till nowadays in Andalusia.
The Cordova synagogue was rebuilt during the Christian era, apparently on the foundations of a synagogue from Muslim times. Yehuda Halevi could certainly have prayed here, maybe also Moses, the son of Maimon. We have no real knowledge about this place, apart from an inscription made by a Jew who restored the building at the beginning of the 14th century. A humble temple, a house of testament, restored by Isaac Moheb, son of the noble Ephraim, in the year 75. Yea, hearken, O Lord, and hasten to rebuild Jerusalem. Even here, in the words of Yehuda Halevi, my heart is in the east, though I be farthest west. Even though they enjoyed all the luxury of Spain, as he called it, they still thought of Jerusalem. And when I dream of thy restoration, I am as a harp to thy song.
¿Hola, Vale?
Hola.
Bueno, pues ya está, ¿no? No van a detener mucho rato, aquí están nuestros amigos allí esperando. ¿A qué nos están esperando por allí adelante? Queremos entrar en una caseta.
As in the days of Yehuda Halevi, Cordova still loves to deck itself out with flowers, to eat and drink, dance and sing. Seeing young Andalusian girls on their way to the fiesta, I thought again about those words written by Yehuda Halevi. It would seem so easy to abandon all the good of Spain. I tried to imagine their great-great-grandmothers about whom he wrote. Let there be darkness, let there be light, the light of thy countenance, the darkness of thy locks. I was seeking the gazelle which he described. Her lips are nectar, her nose myrrh, her cheek the sun, her hair the clouds. And those eyes, like arrows that cannot miss the heart. Watching the events with a 1,000-year perspective, I pondered about that golden age, which enlightened our Middle Ages with poetry, wisdom, and science, seeking a balance between sacred and profane, and taught us how to live both as Jews and as human beings.
Y no coja la senda del mar y se cierre mi pronto tu herida. Ojalá que pudiera durar y se cierre mi pronto tu herida.